Good evening and welcome everyone to our fourth presentation of the year. I'm Brent Taylor, the convener of the speaker program for Military History and Heritage Victoria. And on behalf of our committee, I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. The speaker tonight is Anthony McAleer, speaking about Great Courage and Initiative, the heroic life of George Ingram, VC-MM. Now, a little about Anthony. Anthony works for Museums Victoria for the past 23 years, where he currently manages the dedicated visitor engagement team at the Immigration Museum. For the last 35 years, he's been involved with numerous community groups, mainly historical societies and RSL clubs. He's written 24 books and edited 3, mainly to do with the history of the Yarra Valley, including his detailed accounts of the area's military heritage and the recently published Yarra Valley Vietnam Veterans. He's also been responsible for the creation of some 60 memorials in the Yarra Valley area, mainly recognising the district's military history. His achievements include being awarded the Shire of Yarra Ranges Citizen of the Year in 1997, a Casey Electorate Special Community Achievement Award in 2016, and in 2018 receiving a Medal of Order of Australia for outstanding community service and for achievements in military history. Now, just for a little bit of process before Anthony begins, most of you will know all this, but I will go through it anyway. He'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation. You can ask your questions in one of two ways. You can post a chat anytime up to and including question time, and address the question to everybody. When the time comes, I'll read your question using the name that appears on your computer identity. Or if you can wait and put your hand up during question time, and I'll invite you to ask your question verbally. Anthony's happy for cameras to be on. Make sure your microphones are switched off. You should be on and speaker view. And I now invite Anthony to speak. Over to you, Anthony.
Okay, now here's the big test. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Yes, fantastic. Okay. So, George Mawby Ingram. He was born March 18th, 1889. He was the second of 4 children to George Ronald Ingram and Charlotte Ingram. His grandparents had all come out from Scotland in the 1840s and were early pioneers in Victoria. Over the next decade, like everyone else, they were all involved in the gold rush, but eventually settled on the land. Okay. Now, why isn't that? There we go. So his father's family had taken up blocks at Huntly and Bagshot, about 20 kilometres northeast of Bendigo. And his mother's family had land at Paran and Seville in the Yarra Valley. George's grandfather, Alexander Ingram, and I must tell you from the outset, there are 3 Alexander Ingrams and 4 George Ingrams in this story. So I will do my best to try not to confuse you. So Alexander Ingram established a successful winery at Bagshot, and he ran this for a number of years. And George's father, also George Ingram, grew up here. When his father married his mother, Charlotte Hubbard, they moved onto the property as well and ran it after his grandfather passed away. However, George's mother was a staunch Methodist, and as a strict follower of the temperance movement, wasn't exactly happy that they produced wine. So as a result, they sold this property and they purchased a fruit orchard on the north side of Bagshot, and it was here where George was born in 1889. There's a little memorial there in Bagshot now, which I've got a photo of. That's just out front of the Bagshot Hall, which recognises that George was born there. He already had an older brother, Ronald, and together they started school at the Bagshot State School. A younger brother, Alex, was also born at Bagshot, and a sister, Elsie, was born later. In 1895, the family moved to Seville in the Yarra Valley between Lilydale and Yarra Junction, where his mother's family, the Hubbards, were pioneers. The Ingrams purchased a 10-acre farm and orchard off the Warburton Highway on the hill that led to the school, and soon after, his father became the local mail contractor. George grew up in Seville. He attended the Seville State School along with his brothers and cousins, was again involved with the local Methodist Church, and became a member of the temperance group, the Band of Hope, where at the age of 7, he signed the pledge to not indulge in intoxicating liquor, and there is no evidence actually to suggest that he didn't stick to this for the rest of his life. So during this time, he would help his father with his postal business, and as a result, he regularly walked down every street and road and visited almost every property in the Seville township, becoming quite well known in the process. Now, this is not to say that his family didn't have their fair share of hard times. In 1902, his 6-year-old sister Elsie died suddenly, and a few years later, George was lucky not to have suffered a similar fate when he accidentally wounded himself in the leg with an axe while chopping firewood for his father. As there was no doctor in Seville, he had to be taken to Lilydale to be operated on by the doctor there. His teenage years were also problematic, and he found himself getting into trouble. Now, this culminated with George, his brother Ronald, and his cousin Alfred Hubbard having a run-in with the law and being charged and fined at the Lilydale Police Court over an incident where they killed their teacher's dog. Now, in the end, he was sent away to live with family in Prahran, who organised for him to get him an apprenticeship as a carpenter. Now, as was the thinking at the time, a dose of military discipline always sorted out a wayward youth. And so they had him join, on a part-time basis, the Australian Garrison Artillery. Now, this was his first experience with the military, and he quite enjoyed it. He trained at the forts of Queenscliff and Point Nepean, and even travelled to New Zealand as part of a contingent in 1907 to compete in a military tournament. His 3 years' service here certainly set him on the straight and narrow, and he never had an issue again with the law. But what is important to note, that even though we honour George Ingram as a war hero, that he was in fact human. He had his flaws and he had his troubled times like any of us, but he did turn these around for himself, and he came through them very much a better person for it. So George worked as a carpenter and a builder, and in 1910 he married Jane Nichols before moving into a home in Chestnut Street, Murrumbeena. In August 1914, war began, and a few months later, on December 10th, George walked into the recruiting depot at the Melbourne Town Hall, and he enlisted to serve in the AIF. What changed the course of George's war was the fact that he wrote on his papers that he'd had 3 years' experience with the Australian Garrison Artillery. Now, at that time, the Department of Defence were looking at recruiting a tropical force to go to the former German colony at Rabaul. 2 months earlier, an Australian naval military expeditionary force had landed there and quickly took control of the German forces stationed at Rabaul. As this unit was due to return to Australia soon, the Department of Defence decided to put together a garrison unit, the Tropical Force, to replace them. However, what they really needed were men with artillery experience to man the guns there. As almost everyone else with that experience had been ordered to remain on duty on the coastal defences around Australia, George's previous service appealed to them. Soon after, George was asked to join the Tropical Force. For him, this seemed the quickest way to see any action. At that time, the AIF were not going to Europe, but were looking at being garrisoned in Egypt, and Rabaul had been the only place where Australians had seen any fighting. As a result, he signed up. George arrived in Rabaul in March 1915 and was seconded to man the guns set up on Matubi Island that guarded Rabaul's Simpson Harbour. If George had chosen this posting because that was where the action was, he'd made a huge mistake. Life here was all about garrison duties, remote and isolated from Australia, with little more to do than to swat mosquitoes and look out over the Pacific Ocean. To make matters worse, the Australian forces had now landed on Gallipoli and were in the thick of it, and both his brothers had written to him to say they were going to enlist and would be in action soon. It looked like George would spend the Great War banished on a tropical island, being forced to undertake routine garrison duties. But then, in November, he contracted malaria and was sent to hospital. Assessed by the doctors, they decided to send him back to Australia for treatment. And 5 weeks later, the medical authorities deemed him unfit for service, and on January 19th, 1916, he was discharged from the tropical force. 5 hours later, he walked back into the recruiting depot at the Melbourne Town Hall and he enlisted for service once again with the AIF. Now, as he was not permitted to do so, he decided to change his name on his AIF form to cover his tracks. Well, he really just changed the spelling of his middle name, which was Mawby, and he changed it from M-A-W-B-Y to M-O-R-B-Y. But by doing this, he has created great confusion amongst historians ever since, as he went on to win glory under the M-O-R-B-Y name. In fact, most references you'll find on the internet today have the wrong spelling of his middle name. Now, George may have got over his initial bout of malaria, but as anyone who has contracted the disease can tell you, it keeps coming back. He was not long in the AIF when he came down with the disease again, and he ended up in the military hospital at Langwarrin. At this stage, someone must have become aware of his past military experience, because when he came out of the hospital, he was quickly promoted from private to sergeant and sent to the army depot at Royal Park to train new recruits. Again, while here, he must have impressed someone, because he was soon sent off to undergo officer training at Duntroon in Canberra. In those days, an officer training course ran for 3 years. However, his old mate malaria stepped in again not long after he arrived, and as Duntroon only takes the best of the best, he was discharged from the course and sent back to Melbourne. Mind you, if he hadn't got malaria there, he would have spent the rest of the war training at Duntroon, coming out in 1919 to a peacetime army. Now, back at Royal Park, he was determined to now get overseas and had himself transferred into the next group of reinforcements leaving for Europe, men bound to wear the red and white diamond of the 24th Battalion. Now, by this time, George's older brother Ronald and younger brother Alex had already enlisted and left for Europe. This is a picture of the three brothers here. George is standing at the back, Alex is on the left, and Ronald is on the right. The great dark cloud that casts a long shadow over the George Ingram story is what happened to his two brothers in the war. It is important. It is something that haunted him and his parents for many years. And it is an important lesson for all of us on the sacrifice many families like the Ingrams made during the First World War. The three brothers were all close, growing up together on their family property in Seville. When George enlisted to serve in December 1914, Ronald was working in New Zealand and Alex was employed as a mechanic on the Victorian Railways. Both his brothers were inspired by George's decision to join up, and it became a catalyst for both brothers to enlist themselves, although, as fate would have it, they would experience action in the war before he did. In January 1916, Alex Ingram, pictured here, enlisted in the AIF, and a month later, before he went into camp at Broadmeadows, he married his longtime sweetheart, Agnes Wright. In camp, Alex was allotted to the newly formed unit called the 3rd Pioneer Battalion. Also to serve in this unit would be Walter Peeler, who later went on to be awarded the Victoria Cross in France, and Lyle Howard, the father of former Prime Minister John Howard. Before Alex left for the front, the people of Seville gave him a farewell function in the Seville Public Hall, where they presented him with a wristwatch in appreciation of his service. His new bride, Agnes, also gave him a greenstone heart, a sweetheart keepsake to carry with him while he was away. Driver Alex Ingram arrived in England in July 1916. He underwent further training at Salisbury and in November was sent across the Channel to France, where the unit were billeted at Armentières. Alex wouldn't be here long. On January 3rd, 1917, he was driving a wagon with horses not far from here when he came under German artillery fire from gas shells. When his mates found him, both he and his horse were dead. It is not known whether it was from the blast or the gas that killed them. He was just 25 years old. Alex was buried in a war cemetery at Armentières. His young wife, Agnes, received a telegram that was delivered by the local reverend, telling her that he had been killed in action. A package of his effects were later sent to her that included the watch the people of Seville had presented to him and the greenstone heart she had given him. Agnes never remarried and remained Alex's widow until her death in the 1960s. Their older brother, Ronald, was working in New Zealand when he decided to join up, and he enlisted in the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, being allotted to the reinforcements for the Otago Regiment. He did his initial training at Featherstone Camp near Wellington and arrived in England in August 1916, where he underwent further training at Salisbury. He joined his unit in France in October 1916. He served with the Otago Regiment in the Western Front through their campaigns at Armentières, Courdenay, and Messines. In August 1917, they were involved in the Third Battle of Ypres, and on October 12th, his battalion attacked the Passchendaele Ridge. On this day, they launched an attack against overwhelming enemy fire with little cover and were almost completely wiped out. Ronald Ingram was one of those who charged up the ridge that day, but his body was never recovered, or at least never recognised from the hundreds of war dead on that battlefield. As his body was never found, he couldn't be given a grave, so therefore he is remembered on the memorial at the Tyne-Cot War Cemetery in Belgium. For George Ingram's parents, it was a tough cross to bear. They had 4 children, of which 3 had now died, leaving George as their only child. Few families in the Yarra Valley would feel the pain of the war more keenly than the Ingram family. The editor of the local paper wrote, "While there are few families now not directly represented in the titanic struggle, none could do more in the cause of liberty than this family from Seville, because, like the widow in the parable, they have given their all." George Ingram arrived at the 24th Battalion in France in late February 1917 and didn't have to wait long for his baptism of fire, which came a few weeks later during the Battle of Bapaume. By this stage, his younger brother Alex had been killed, and this may have spurred him on because he went on to be awarded the military medal for his actions in this campaign, the first time he had been in action. Over the next 2 years, he experienced all the horror and heroism of the Western Front, alongside the men who proudly wore the red and white diamond of the 24th Battalion. 4 times he was taken from the front line sick or injured, once for influenza, twice for a reoccurrence of malaria. I don't know how many guys on the Western Front suffered from malaria, but he certainly did. And the last was for when he was blown by a shell blast across the top of a trench and was then half buried as he landed at the bottom, resulting in the dislocation of his knee and giving him a limp that he had for the rest of his life. He went on to survive the killing grounds of Bullecourt, Ypres, Flanders, Passchendaele, and Villers-Bretonneux, and was one of the few survivors of that horrific yet miraculous battle to take Mons and Quintin. He rarely ever spoke of these times, but in 1956, he was pushed by an English reporter for a comment, and he told him straight out, 6 times in 6 days in France, our unit was brought up to its full strength of 600 men. Each morning, for 6 mornings, there were less than 100 left. By October 5th, 1918, George Ingram had already served for over 2 years with the 24th Infantry Battalion on the Western Front. He had also seen many good mates die, and both of his beloved brothers had by now been killed in the war. On October 4th, 1918, the 24th Battalion had just come out of the Battle of Beauvoir, when suddenly they received word there would be one more battle. At dawn the next day, they were to attack the village of Montbrehant and take the high ground near it. It was a strongly held German position that had been reinforced by more troops, and to make matters worse, they were to advance uphill over ground which was exceedingly rough and was covered with wire. The following is what happened to George in this battle, and it actually comes from a variety of sources that have pieced together the story. So at 3 a.m. on the morning of October 5th, the men of the 24th Battalion were ordered to prepare for the attack. A few hours later, an artillery barrage began and they moved forward. From the outset, the enemy fire was intense, and George was with a group in the centre of the advance. What happened next was to be George Ingram's moment in history. During the attack, he was in charge of a platoon. About 100 yards from the starting point, severe enemy machine gun fire was encountered from a strong post that had escaped the artillery fire, and as a result, the advance was held up. Realising that a delay would mean heavy casualties, they were ordered to prepare to charge the enemy. At the word go, the company swept up the hill with a yell, and with George leading the charge from one flank. The enemy, with enough machine guns and rifles to stop a brigade, were firing just over the heads of the men who swept into the first enemy stronghold. George dashed out and, under cover of fire of a Lewis gun, rushed the post at the head of his men. The post contained 9 machine guns and 42 Germans, who fired until the Australians were within 3 yards of them. A sharp, short, hand-to-hand fight then disposed of the Germans to a man, with George accounting for no less than 18 of them. A number of enemy posts were then observed to be firing on our men further forward, so they moved up to attack them also. They reorganised behind an embankment, but ended up being pinned down by intense machine gun fire. Even so, George was able to rush several small posts that were in front of him. With the artillery barrage finished, George then quickly seized the situation, rallied his men in the face of murderous fire, and, with magnificent courage and resolution, led them forward. He himself rushed the first post, shot 6 of the enemy, and captured a machine gun. When they dashed onto the second strong post and were able to overtake the enemy, George then saw enemy fire coming from a quarry to the left. An Australian tank was then seen in the village and was called over by George's men waving helmets on rifles. As it passed, George jumped out and, calling, "Follow me," moved with it while directing his men. It was then seen that the Germans were lining the edge of the big quarry. As the tank circled the quarry, George jumped in amongst the Germans and his men followed him. After much fighting, they overcame the large number of enemy who were in there. George then observed an enemy machine gun fire through the gap in the wall of a house 20 yards away. Without hesitation and entirely alone, He scrambled up the edge of the quarry. He ran around the rear of the house, and he entered from the far side. He shot the enemy gunner through the gap in the wall. He then fired several more shots, and seeing some enemy jump out the window of the house, he burst open a door, rushed to the head of the stairs leading to the cellar, and he forced 62 of the enemy to surrender. Soon after this, he discovered that he was out of communication with the company on his left flank. So he went out alone and made a personal reconnaissance under heavy fire, and succeeded in gaining communication with the other company, which had lost all of its officers. After stationing several posts, George went back with the tank, and he found his men on the western edge of the hill, where they had been caught by terrible fire from the village. He personally placed a post on his left flank to ensure its safety, and then he reconnoitred and established 2 posts on his right flank. All of this was done in the face of continuous machine gun and shell fire. Throughout the day, he showed the most splendid qualities of courage and leadership, and he freely exposed himself to enemy fire again and again with utter contempt for the danger that he faced. By his example, he encouraged his men to keep up a constant fire on the enemy, that not only did he levy a large toll of casualties upon them, but was responsible for destroying counterattacks on his front. He personally inflicted 40 fatal casualties on the enemy, not including the large number of prisoners that he captured. By 8 p.m. that night, the 24th Battalion had achieved their objectives. The capture of Montbrehan was a brilliant but expensive victory, and ended up being the 24th Battalion's last battle and the AIF's last action of the war. For his actions on this day, George Ingram was later awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for gallantry in battle, and the last awarded to an Australian in World War I. What George experienced on this day was nothing short of horrific. In fact, no Australian Victoria Cross is more soaked with blood than George Ingram's. It was certainly no boy's own adventure. Sure, there is certainly bravery, courage, and gallantry as part of the story, but it was also a horrific and traumatic event for anyone to have gone through. George was responsible for the death of some 40 enemy soldiers on that day. All were killed in close hand-to-hand combat. In fact, he probably would have looked into the faces of many of those that he killed at Montbrehan. At the same time, he saw some of his closest mates from the 24th Battalion either killed or wounded in that battle. All of this would have haunted him. His widow, Myrtle Ingram, later said he told her it was the death of his 2 brothers that had played on him that day. So revenge may have played a part in his psyche that morning in the village of Montbrehan. It is little wonder that for the rest of his life, he could never bring himself to talk about his actions on this day. Not long after, he returned home and was given a huge public reception at the Seville Hall, and he was pushed by the crowd to give an account of his actions on that day. But he couldn't. He remained silent. There are no doubts that George returned home to Australia suffering both physically and mentally as a result of his wartime experiences. The people of Seville gave him a huge welcome home function in the Seville Public Hall when he arrived back. On the night, local dignitaries made speeches, songs were sung, the Lilydale RSL made him a life member of the club, and the Shire of Lilydale presented him with an 18-carat gold watch and chain inscribed from the people of the district. Also on the night, his old school friend, Mrs. E. Wallace, recited a poem she wrote in his honour, the last paragraph of which says, "We are proud of our schoolmate and proud of his deeds that gained him the coveted cross, and we welcome him back to the land of his birth, the land of the Southern Cross." Upon returning home, it took him a long time to come to terms with the adulation around the Victoria Cross, always trying to deflect from himself and push to the front the deeds of others with him on that day. He refused to head the Shire of Lilydale Peace March in 1919. He didn't like to be out front as a war hero. Later on, he felt more comfortable after he came to accept the award as being more representative of the 24th Battalion than himself. Survivor's guilt was not recognised then, nor was PTSD. The decades that followed the war were very tough years for him. He arrived back home to discover that his wife had deserted him, and physically he couldn't go back to his old job as a carpenter. In 1920, he had a complete breakdown and retreated to his parents' property in Seville. His mother wrote to friends saying, "George has returned home, tired and weary from war." In 1921, he got a job as a supervisor on the building of war service homes in Hampton, but the corruption that he witnessed there distressed him. He then ran his own woodyard in Carnegie, but he couldn't cope with it and the business failed. He then took on a soldier settlement farm in Dandenong, and again, he no longer had the strength to work it, and in the end, his parents had to come and assist him on the block. In fact, it was during this time that a huge swelling developed under his jaw that became infected, resulting in him being sent to hospital for an operation where they found shrapnel from the war embedded under his chin. Now, this was a decade after he had returned from the war. In the end, like hundreds of others, he was forced to just walk off the block in Dandenong, unable to continue. He drifted back to the city. He remarried, had a son, George Ingram Jr., and a daughter, Bapaume, who sadly died of influenza, aged only 2. And he took on jobs where he could. The Depression then hit and things became much worse for him. In 1932, he had a complete physical and mental breakdown and he couldn't work for 6 months. At this point, he approached the Department of Repatriation in the hope of getting a pension. They assessed his situation and his condition, and they decided to give him no more than 33% of the pension. George was a war hero, a Victoria Cross and Military Medal recipient, the type of person society puts on a pedestal. So imagine how other ex-servicemen were treated. Those men of the First World War were all promised that they would all return to a land fit for heroes. For many like George, the post-war years lived up to little of these expectations. It is no wonder that so many ended up alcoholics or in asylums, or worse still, took their own lives. What happened to be George Ingram's saviour was the Shrine Guard. Melbourne's Shrine of Remembrance began as an idea for a permanent and symbolic reminder of the debt that was owed to those who had served and died in the First World War. It grew to become Victoria's great centre of remembrance, a monumental public memorial that was grand in size, but appropriate in its reverence and admiration, and was designed to provide for both ceremonial events of commemoration and individual solitude. In December 1934, it was announced that the Victoria Police would take on 14 former AIF servicemen into the force, whose job it would be to protect the Shrine of Remembrance. By January 1935, over 250 applicants were received, including one from George Ingram VCMM. George looked upon this opportunity as an ideal career change for him. Not only would he have a stable career close to home and have the chance to continue to work outdoors, he would also be working in a position where he would be the guardian of a memorial that was dedicated to the memory of his fellow diggers that didn't return, including his 2 brothers, Alex and Ronald, and dozens of his mates from the 24th Battalion. George was one who was accepted for the first intake, and on April 8th, 1935, George Ingram was sworn in as Constable 8987 of the Shrine Guards. By doing so, this made him the highest decorated member to have served with the Victoria Police, a record that still stands to this day. They all commenced their duties at the shrine on August 21st, 1935. In fact, George was the first guardsman to be posted outside of the Government House gates, a duty that would be part of their responsibility. A few days later, they were inspected by the Governor, Lord Huntingfield, and a photo appeared in the paper the next day of him chatting to George. Over the years, both Lord and Lady Huntingfield would often stop to talk with him while he was on duty outside of the gate. From now on, the one distinct duty of these men was to provide a 24-hour guard for the shrine or assist at various ceremonial events. They were armed for the job with .303 rifles with bayonets and sidearms, and their shifts required a mixture of stationary roles around the monument and patrolling the grounds on foot. It was fairly routine work, but they were appreciated by the people of Melbourne and respected for the manner in which they carried out their duties. One newspaper reporter described them as a distinguished addition to the nobility of the shrine. But for these men who had all survived the horrors of the Great War, it was also rewarding work. They were the ones who witnessed in those post-war years the importance of the shrine to families who had lost loved ones in the conflict. For most families, this was their substitute for the grave they would never see in a war cemetery on the other side of the world. As it was a commanding visual reminder of society's gratitude, it also helped to ease the trauma for a generation who had given so much. It was no small matter to them that having a Victoria Cross awardee on duty protecting it also gave them a great sense of pride. For George, his time serving as a shrine guard was a happy period for him. Very few of his long-term health issues troubled him anymore, and apart from a week when he was injured on the job, he only ever took 2 days sick leave. Then on September 3rd, 1939, Australia declared war on Germany once more. A few weeks later, the government announced it was forming a special force, a division of men that would be trained for service at home or abroad, whatever the circumstances dictated. George and other former diggers were conscious of the fact that during their war service they had acquired skills and experience that could now be of use to their nation in its time of need. They also felt that after what they had been through in France, they couldn't just stand by and let Germany rage its war machine once more without doing something. In early November, he took some leave to think the situation over, and then on November 17th, 1939, he walked into the drill hall in Sturt Street, South Melbourne, and once again enlisted to serve his country. He was 50 years old. Eager to serve in whatever capacity was needed, he hoped to be part of the Special Force, but fate again had something else in store for him. Australia was ill-prepared for total war. They needed personnel with experience in how the military worked and did things. They didn't have time to train someone. At the time, Command were looking at forming a workshop and park company of engineers in Victoria to assist in the efficient handling of the engineer services. George seemed to tick most of the boxes for what they wanted. He had held a commission in the 24th Battalion in the AIF. He had qualifications as a builder, and he was, if he was in the job, it also freed up a younger officer to be involved in more active service. They then approached George if he was interested in being appointed a commissioned officer with this unit, and he jumped at the chance. The only problem was that he was still with the Victorian Police Force. The Army had to apply to the Chief Commissioner for his release for the duration of the war and 12 months thereafter. A month later, they approved for him to take an extended leave of absence from the Shrine Guards for service in the Australian military forces. For the next 4 years, he was promoted to the rank of captain, and he served with the Royal Australian Engineers at Seymour Camp and Kapuka in New South Wales. He even spent time at the POW camp at Chatura. In the end, he started to suffer ill health and was discharged in May 1944. At the same time, he had turned 55 and as a result was retired from the Victoria Police Force. The last entries in his police file state that his character was exemplary and that he was well conducted and performed his duties with the Shrine Guard efficiently. George Ingram's days in uniform were now over. He was then offered a position as a general foreman with EA and Frank Watts Proprietary Limited. At the time, they were one of the largest building and construction firms in Melbourne. Even though the war had slowed the building industry down, Watts were able to pick up a number of defence contracts across 3 states that kept them busy, including the aircraft factories at Fisherman's Bend. George was with them in an era when the firm flourished. In the post-war years, there were new constructions happening everywhere. Office buildings in the city, hospitals in the suburbs, and factories on the outskirts of town. He used his deferred pay from the army to buy a new brick veneer home in Ascot Vale, close enough for him to see his beloved Essendon play. His wife passed away in 1951, and 8 months later, he married for a 3rd time. Maybe he should have got the VC for that, actually. He married for a 3rd time Myrtle Thomas, a widow with a young son, George. The following year, George and Myrtle had a son, Alex Ronald Ingram, named after his 2 brothers who had been lost in the war. In 1956, the whole family went to London for the celebrations around the centenary of the Victoria Cross, and while here, went across to France to visit his brothers' graves. When he got to his brother Alex's grave, he took out from his pocket a jar of soil from the Ingram's family home in Seville, and he spread it on his brother's gravesite, making a physical and symbolic connection between his hometown and one who had left from the Yarra Valley and made the ultimate sacrifice. At the age of 70, he retired from E.A. Watts, and in true George Ingram fashion, he bit off more than he could chew, and he decided to go and build a house for his family down at Hastings. George rarely ever talked about the war, and he never spoke about the actions for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross. His repat file states he continued to suffer from nightmares about the war into his later years. In 1961, he was asked by the 24th Battalion Association to lead them in the Anzac Day March. It was a proud moment for him, and sadly, it would be the last time he would get to be with this group of men, the men who proudly wore the red and white diamond. His health was worsening, and not long after this event, he suffered a heart attack and he passed away soon after. He is buried at the Frankston Cemetery, and each Anzac Day, Lee Andrews, a Shrine Guard and member of the Frankston RSL, places a flag and flowers on his grave, lest we forget. And I just want to show you a couple of interesting George Ingram memorials. So up the top left-hand side, this is the memorial that's out the front of the Bagshot Public Hall. And this is commemorates the fact that George was born in Bagshot and recognises him there. The other memorial that's there is at the gates of the Seville Primary School, the former school that George attended. In fact, the bottom left-hand corner there, you can see the building, the school building. That's the original school building that George and his brothers would have attended. On each side of the gates, there are plaques. One details the biography of George. The other one talks about how he was came to be awarded the Victoria Cross. at the entrance to Seville, on sort of the Warburton Highway, there is a sign there that recognises that it was the childhood home of George Ingram. On the right-hand side, this is a memorial that's down in Hastings, which was the last home that George had, which was down there. The most spectacular, though, is the Seville War Memorial. And although this has come up a little bit blurry, but I've got some better photos. So the Seville War Memorial, if you concentrate on that image on the left-hand side there, is 4 glass panels. Each of those glass panels stands about 3.5 meters high, forming almost like a pyramid sort of shape, almost. And on the outside of the panels are the stories of 4 different people from Seville who served our country in time of war. So this gives you a better idea. So this is the George Ingram panel. As you can see there, you've got the image of George. You've got the VC. At the bottom there is a picture of Montbrahon. There is at the front there details of how he came to be awarded the Victoria Cross. If you go inside of the memorial on the opposite side, you can see there on the right-hand side, on the back of that glass panel is a biography of George. There's also a timeline at the bottom there. And I don't know if many of you will recognise that person. Having a good look at that, that's Major General Mike Phelps, who actually unveiled it for us. O'Brien, sorry. And this is at the opening of the George Ingram panel, and you've got members of the Shrine Guard. You've got Inspector Mike Lindsay, who was in charge of the Shrine Guard, and the fellow with the hat and the medals on his right-hand side is George's son, Alex Ingram. And today, it is visited each year by the school, the Seville Primary School. They come down, they learn about all of the men that are recognised on that memorial. You can see it's in a beautiful little parkland, and we've purposely made the colours so that they don't stand out; they blend in with the park. It's not something that's really, we wanted it sort of to look very natural. And as I said, each of those panels has the story of a different serviceman from Seville. The one that you're looking at there on the left-hand side is George Cassidy, who enlisted when he was 16 and was in the 4th Light Horse. On the right-hand side is Bruce Bethune, who died while in active service in New Guinea. He was 18 in World War II. We've got him in colour and his mother in black and white to represent the grief that she experienced. And this is what we've got lights on it. This is what it looks like of a nighttime. Every night the lights come on and shine up the memorial, and you can see there that's what it looks like on Anzac Day. And if you are interested, there is a biography on George Ingram, which I've written. You will find that on eBay. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about his story, it's certainly in there. And that's what I've got. Thank you very much for your time.
What a tremendous story. Big life. It beholds me to say thank you very much, Anthony, for an excellent presentation. And now we've got a couple of other little bits of information, bits of business to do for the MWHV. You're welcome to listen.
Yeah,
or if you feel you want to head off, don't feel embarrassed. So thank you for that. What do we got here, Jason? There we are. So, So we've got 2 events coming up before the end of the year. No, not before the end. Yes, before the end of the year. Life So Full of Promise will be from Ross McMullen, another one of his books, and he's an excellent speaker. So he'll be speaking on the 30th of October. And on the 16th of November, we have In Flight, the Australians and war at war in Burma, 1942 to 45. That'll be a one-day conference at the Caulfield RSL. So that's what's coming up from us. And with that, I think I will draw I don't think I've got anything more to say, except that thanks to Anthony, Jason, who keeps everything going behind, and thank you for joining us again. Hope you come again, and good night from the committee and myself.